This month, we're celebrating Black History Month and the theme of Black health and wellness. Today, we want to look at the past to acknowledge the harm caused to BIPOC communities, not just to learn, but to inform our actions and better improve their physical, mental, and emotional wellness. The Discussions of Mistrust in Healthcare and Research Entity series are centered on having open conversations about academic research distrust in communities of color. Today's discussion will serve to provide a historical context on how distrust developed. In the second panel of the discussion series, we'll explore participant protections, detection, and reporting contemporary harm. And in the last panel, how to build reciprocal relationships between community and academic entities. These discussions will be in a Q&A format navigated by a facilitator. Candace Henley is an accomplished executive director with significant experience in community outreach, patient advocacy, and a superior record of successful community service and engagement. Candace is a 16-year colon cancer survivor who shares her story of challenging battle with a positive attitude and faith that inspires others to never give up. After years of advocating, Candace identified a need for grassroots awareness and education of colorectal cancer in minority and medically underserved communities and started the Blue Hat Foundation in 2015. The organization utilizes community partnerships with healthcare providers, physicians, and hospital systems to deliver the message of the importance of early detection, knowing your family medical history, and free screening. Dr. Linda Ray Murray has spent her career serving the medically underserved. She has worked in leadership roles in many public health organizations, including the National Association of City and County Health Officers, Health Equity and Social Justice Team, and in 2011 as APHA's president. Today, she serves as an honorary attending of Cook County Health and as an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Illinois School of Public Health. She remains passionate about increasing the number of Black and Latino health professionals and serves on the Urban Health Program Community Advisory Committee at the University of Illinois. She has been a voice for social justice and health as a basic human right for over 50 years. Jose Lopez serves as the executive director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center Juan Antonio Cortijer in Chicago, which he co-founded in 1973, and is an adjunct professor at Columbia College and the University of Illinois at Chicago. Additionally, he is the co-founder of several major community-based institutions, which among them is Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos Puerto Rican High School, an alternative school serving at-risk youth, El Rincon Community Mental Health Center, and the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture. Presently, he is active in developing new praxis theory in community and social empowerment, particularly in the areas of educational reform to the community as a campus initiative and addressing health inequities through the building of a holistic community of wellness in Chicago's greater Humboldt Park communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Ray Murray, Jose Lopez, and Candace Henley.
So thank you both so much for being with us. Fortunately, Candace Henley has not yet hopped on, but I'm going to start the conversation. As you both know, I'm huge fans of yours. And again, thank you so much. So we're going to start off with some questions. Knowing the history of the exploitive relationship communities of color have with research and entities is essential to understand how deep-rooted mistrust is within communities. Can you provide historical context to serve as a framework for today's conversation? And specifically, Senor Jose, can you specifically share how research has conducted on the development of the birth control pill in Puerto Rico. Oh, Jose, you're on mute.
So thank you for inviting us. I'm always honored to be here with Linda Ray Murray. She's an institution for all of us, and obviously for her work and commitment. I am not going to be able to stay all the way through. I had indicated this because I have a very important appointment and I have to leave by about 12:45. So very briefly, let me just say that for me, the very idea of Western science and Western colonial enterprise have always been linked since more than 500 years ago. We reduced the knowledge of indigenous people and original people to the idea that this was oscurantism, that it was black magic, that it was obviously something that you didn't need to explore or even talk about. Indigenous knowledge was reduced to the language of magic. And so there began this process that ultimately, I believe, informs much of how we think about science and how we even talk about science. Even the language of science is racist. The language of science is elitist. The language and the practice sometimes of research is both elitist and exclusive. And in the case of Puerto Rico, we can go back to 1898 when Puerto Rico was taken over by the US and turned into what the US Supreme Court declares Puerto Rico belongs to, but it's not a part of the United States. No, since 1898, Puerto Rico has been ruled under the doctrine of separate and unequal, because Puerto Ricans were considered a mongrel race, and this has not changed. So that gave an opening, particularly in the early part of the 1900s, the establishment of a school of tropical medicine in Puerto Rico that used Puerto Ricans as guinea pigs in order to bring about changes to make sure that you could bring controlled tropical diseases, as they were called, so US soldiers and US settlers could establish themselves in the Caribbean as well as in Central America, particularly in Panama. In the early 1900s, Dr. Ashford would lead this effort in Puerto Rico and create the School of Tropical Medicine. He was followed in the 1930s by a man by the name of Cornelius Rhodes, who actually put together a plan to exterminate Puerto Ricans and use them as guinea pigs in an effort to address the issue of cancer. At that time, Puerto Rico was going through a horrific situation, an epidemic of tuberculosis, and he was brought in, and ultimately there is evidence, and he even wrote a plan of how you could get rid of Puerto Ricans by using them as guinea pigs to explore cures for cancer. And then in the 1930s, you begin in 1940s, a very extensive attempt to birth control in terms of sterilization. And then in 1950s, Puerto Rican women were used as guinea pigs for the birth control pill that would later on obviously serve for women to determine their bodies. But in Puerto Rico, it was used as a way to experiment. So that's just a little idea of how this knowledge and language and colonialism are used.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Linda Ray Murray, how do you, or why do you think that 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 the Tuskegee syphilis study was able to continue for 40 years?
I think Jose's already answered that. I want to say hello, Jose. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And let me do a commercial before I answer that question. There's a wonderful documentary called Take Action, which is based on the takeover of the Lincoln Hospital of the Young Lords in the 70s. You can see it free on YouTube. It made the long list for the Academy Award. So I just had a chance to re-look at that footage. So go to YouTube and search on Take Action and pay attention. So, we should not be talking about research abuse. I think that Jose has outlined the critical issues. Who is doing the science? It's not a question of not abusing people of color when you quote do research. We need to be questioning, this is what we do in Western world is bad science. Science is a social construct. How we frame the questions is the most important thing. And what I'm interested in is making sure that our communities ask the questions that we want answers to. And until we're asking the questions and setting up the methodologies, we're going to continue to be abused. I don't care how polite people are or whether or not they pay people to participate in the research or whether or not they do informed consent correctly. Those are important things. But to go back to Tuskegee, Tuskegee, we don't teach enough history of science. Tuskegee lasted as long as it did because of racism, because American medicine contributed, it crafted what people now call scientific racism. It is from American medicine that Hitler and the Nazis took their racist notions. They thought the Americans went a little too far, so they softened it a little bit and put in their Nazi racist ideology. So really, the Tuskegee study was set up because American physicians believed there were biological differences based on the color of your skin. And they were interested in studying some of these differences in how syphilis played out. So it wasn't just that they were experimenting, they really were examining this racist, unscientific notion. So that's why it lasted as long as it did. This was considered normal. And just even how we think about people in terms of our contributions to science. So one thing that I think is a jargon term now, but it really is important, but we can't let it get misused by academic institutions, is citizen scientists. I'm not talking about lay people who help the academics do their research. That's a corruption of citizen scientists. What I'm saying is, how do we form the questions we're examining? And how do we use the methodologies to answer those questions? And that's something that needs to be in the hands of people, and it should be. So Tuskegee represents a typical American research. Unfortunately, that's still going on today. We shouldn't pretend that it's not going on. How we frame our questions, how we pretend, maybe that's too strong a word, how we say that we have to do something a certain way in order to keep our funding from NIH, et cetera, because it's, quote, scientific. That's a problem. And we need to challenge those notions. And that means people in the academy need to challenge the notions as well as people outside of the academy. So it's not just a question of how much money community organizations get versus how much money the universities get. That's a crime. And even if we tripled, quadrupled, tenfold the amount of money that community organizations get, it doesn't deal with the issue. This is not the way we should be funding research and human activities to answer questions.
Thank you both for that. So you mentioned asking the right questions. What are the right questions? Can you provide an example of, those questions that could make a difference or might?
Sure. Like with Tuskegee. So they were trying to ask the question, I may be simplifying this. They were trying to ask, first of all, their whole premise was wrong, but let's ignore that. They were trying to ask the question, well, how come neurosyphilis, that is syphilis that it infects the neurological system, looks different in Black people than white people? That's what they were trying to, one of the questions they were trying to answer. But the problem is they weren't asking the question of why do we still have syphilis running around in the United States of America? And why aren't we preventing the transmission of syphilis? That's the right question. Okay. So the sort of biochemical mechanisms are much less important than why are we allowing human beings to suffer from this ancient disease for which we have some curative approaches. So that's what we should be asking. Why do we have human beings still suffering from tuberculosis today, resistant tuberculosis in terms of antibiotics, when this is a disease we should have wiped out? Why do we have most people in the world infected with HIV not getting the appropriate treatment? Why? That's the appropriate question, not the details of how do we make a vaccine to prevent HIV. I mean, that would be wonderful if we could do that, but that's a secondary question as to why we have people, 90% of the world who's infected with HIV still suffering from this disease because they don't have access to the present treatments that we have.
Jose, I see you nodding your head.
I totally agree. I just think that ultimately the basic question to be asked is, how do we incorporate what is known among the people about a particular disease or about a particular health issue? People know a lot more, and our ancestors knew a lot more. Whether, we could take that knowledge and give new dimensions to that knowledge, I think that is possible. I think today when we are dealing with, when we look at the scientific method and we reduce everything to how we isolate things rather than to look at things in an ecosystem. And I believe one of the major problems of science has been to always classify and to isolate. Indigenous knowledge has always been about connecting and understanding ecosystems. So when we look at what are the great discoveries we have made in dealing with cancer, obviously radiation and chemotherapy. On the other hand, the side effects to these two treatments is really quite problematic. And when we study the scientific method in dealing with virus and germs, which are living things, then we've got to look at how isolation leads to conclusions that ultimately is about killing that virus and isolating the virus, killing it, and not dealing with it within its own ecosystem. And it means that we got to begin to look at indigenous knowledge and original people's knowledge that spoke to the intersectionality of all things.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to stick to the script.
Oh, feel free to go off script. It doesn't matter.
Thank you. And both of you touched on this. Like, how have academic and research entities perpetuated systemic and structural racism? And how has this contributed to the lost trust within marginalized communities? I think both of you have already touched on this, but if you can please.
Well, first we have to be careful how we frame this. There was never trust. I mean,
okay.
The problem is not. So the problem is not that there's lost trust.
Right.
There's a, I don't know who wrote these principles, the AAMC, which is the organization, the Association of American Medical Colleges, not who I normally go to for this guy, but they actually have some principles of trustworthiness. And I love the first principle because it states clearly what I think is true. It says, the community is already educated. That's why it doesn't trust you. And that's, so the problem here is not that we've lost trust. There's no reason to trust an organization that is not designed to help us. But what Jose is talking about, and I know that we have students on here, please, we have to, you are not learning science. You should get your tuition back. You're being cheated. They're not teaching you the history of Western science. First, there's a presumption that Western science is correct. That's a problem. But even if we ignore that for a moment, they don't even teach you the history of science and the development of these methods, because even within the Western canon, there are arguments about this. Not everybody agrees, but this reductionist approach, think about this. What it says is, in all situations, if you keep reducing down your view to the smaller and smaller subatomic particles, you will find the truth. Now think about that. Think about, does that make sense if you're trying to understand how a society functions? Does it make sense to go down to some subcellular level? Obviously not. You have to think broadly. You have to think in an integrative way. You have to think about how systems interact with each other. And so the basic premise of Western reductionist methodology means that we're in trouble. That may be useful in a small, tiny fraction of questions, but in general, certainly for understanding human beings and human health, it's not useful at all. So what we should be asking ourselves as scientists is, what question are we trying to explore? And once we ask that question, then we should ask ourselves, what are the best tools that we have to explore that question? And it's not always a reductionist biomedical approach. In fact, most of the time it's not. And so what I say to even people with training in STEM science, you're not being appropriately trained. If you don't understand how the Electoral College impacts your scientific work, then you're in trouble. You should get an F in science, because science is a social construct. And how we frame our questions, what we study, how we study it, are the results of historical arguments and power relationships, etc. And that's why indigenous science has been put to the end, because we are talking about the science of oppressed peoples. And their questions that we have as oppressed people are different. And the methods we've used to develop our understanding of the world is different. And what we should be doing is gathering all of those approaches and appreciating the insights that come from these various different methodological approaches to trying to understand the world and how to change it.
Thank you. This actually is a great segue for my next question. And so how do you think science and research became institutionalized, and by who?
Well, I know Jose has to leave. Let me pause for a moment. So I don't know if Jose wants to start off on that.
That's okay. Go ahead.
It's the same. It's not a separate process. So institutions that have power in a society help frame, what's going on. For most of the Western world, for example, the role of the church, especially the Catholic Church, but not exclusively, the role of religion, and especially before the so-called Enlightenment period, is important. And those are the institutions through which things were measured. In the United States, for American medicine, the debate about whether slavery was justified or not is what framed much of American medicine. You had people, I want to be clear, it's not like everybody thought slavery was justified. That's not true. But many did, and that was the dominant feeling. And that's how American medicine's scientific base is dominantly supported. But there were people in that time period who said, this is bullshit. People are not hierarchically ranked. There's no reason to think that Africans are inferior to other people of the world, or that Chinese are inferior to Frenchmen. So these debates go on, but these debates get buried, just like we're trying to bury so-called critical race theory today. I don't even like how they frame that. But these fights go on all the time in our field. And for those of you who care about public health and research and health equity, that's what this center is dedicated to. Let me just say, and unfortunately, I'm ignorant on this because I'm monolingual English, but in my mind, the most profound and progressive analysis of health inequities and social medicine rests in our Latin American cousins. And they have eloquently articulated a view of social medicine, or as they say, collective health, that I think eloquently talks about this. Fortunately, there's more and more of that literature appearing in English, so ignorant people like me can appreciate it better. But that's what you should be. You should be reading. What are we arguing about health equity? Okay, because the American notion of health equity is backwards, even compared to Europe. But to do that without understanding the critical role that Latin America plays is a major problem.
Jose?
Well, I definitely totally agree with what Linda is proposing. I think that one of the interesting things has been some of the practices that in Cuba you have undertaken in terms of health research and how you have approached medicine and research from a different perspective. That doesn't mean that mistakes have not been made. And I want to point out to one of the ways that science sometimes, and the use of science and the interpretation of science from the vantage point of progress and looking at the whole scheme of Western knowledge as representing progress was really a problem that emerged during the Sandinista revolution, right after the seizure of power in Nicaragua by the Sandinistas. They sent their best medical students to do work in the Mosquito and Blue Fields areas of Nicaragua, which are on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. And obviously, these very young, energetic people went there to bring their latest knowledge about prevention, etc., to the people in those communities. Well, what happened is they didn't listen to the shamans. They didn't listen to the so-called medicine people. They went in there with this very idea that they knew what was best for those populations. Bluefields is an Afro-Caribbean area settled by Black people who were brought from the Caribbean to labor in Central America. The Mosquito are the original, some of the original people of Nicaragua. Well, you didn't value their knowledge. You didn't incorporate them into these preventions. You came in with a whole view that this is the way to do prevention, to do public health. And it ended up where some of those people who were the leaders in those communities, who were the elders, who were the people who had a great deal of knowledge about their own medical situation, saw them as a threat, and ultimately were used by the CIA to create the Contra movement in Nicaragua. So when we look at sometimes with the best of intent, we can use science and medicine without really understanding that you must listen to the people, that the people have a great deal of knowledge, that our grandmothers and great-grandmothers had a lot more knowledge about how they were able to deal with their bodies than many of us, and that maybe looking at what they saw in plants and in the environment, how they saw the immune system work, and maybe if we listen to them, we could develop much better medical research and practices.
I'm always amazed at both of you because both of you are honestly like walking encyclopedias. I admire that so much. So there have been a lot of guidelines and protocols to protect or to not let things like the Tuskegee event happen or the birth control pill in Puerto Rico, such as the common rule. Do you think that these actually made a difference in marginalized communities? Or what impact do you think it had, or if any?
You know, it's hard to argue that no minor differences were made, but it does not solve the problem. You know, and I want to take a moment here, since we just lost Dr. Paul Farmer yesterday, to use HIV as an example. So here we have at least for a little while, we'll see if coronavirus supersedes it, the largest world pandemic, even though we don't talk about it like a worldwide pandemic, but that's exactly what it is. In my career as a practicing physician, HIV/AIDS. So think about this man who is functioning in the richest country in the world, where people are doing magical STEM bench-based research about this particular virus, and understanding again that we need to be able to treat human beings. So as we develop better drugs to suppress HIV and to turn it into a chronic disease, with all the appropriate informed consent. But the reality was, what people were saying in Boston and Chicago and New York, all over the world, is, well, Black people are too stupid to take these complicated drug regimens. They can't tell time. We shouldn't waste our money giving these drugs, antiviral drugs, to Africa, et cetera. And to have a simple, not that Dr. Farmer was simple, but to have a basic, simple approach that says, no, these are human beings. They can take this medicine if we set up the systems that allow them access to the medicine. And so here's a man that we are recognizing his contributions today, who really saved countless lives in his career from tuberculosis and HIV and many other diseases. But to say that his simple notion was, health is a basic human right, and we have to put in place what we need so that every human on the planet has access to what they need to be healthy. Just that concept is such a greater contribution to science than anything else. So I think we have to remember that even though we had all those places, those rules and stuff in place, without a Dr. Farmer and without his ability to raise money and organize partners in health, millions of more people would die in spite of informed consent and all that kind of stuff. So it's the same problem. We reduce the problem of science to informed consent, IRB, et cetera. That was not the fundamental problem with Tuskegee. The fundamental problem with Tuskegee was racism and bad science. That's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem with HIV wasn't that people were unable to follow a complicated regimen. It's because we made a decision as a people of the planet that we didn't give a shit. We don't care about most of the people on the planet. We don't care if they die from HIV. That's the reality. We may care if a few people, on the north side of Chicago die from HIV, but mostly we don't care. And until we're willing to understand that and stand up for what's right and insist that our institutions, University of Illinois, University of Chicago, Northwestern, do that. I understand the financial realities, but we have to fight to change those financial realities. Because if we don't do that, then whatever Northwestern does is not worth it. If in fact most of the city can't have access to that quality of medical care. So Paul Farmer insisted on high quality medical care, no distinction between the medical care one gets in Boston and the medical care one gets in Rwanda. And he was willing to entertain the notion that in fact, he said the medical care people were getting in Rwanda and Haiti, where his people were working, was often superior to the medical care that people were getting in New York or Chicago or Boston. And that's what we have to be willing to understand and fight for.
And how does one do that? Because I totally understand what you're saying. And even as I hear both of you talk, I start getting angry, not at you, but at the system. And how does one change that?
I think Dr. Murray made reference to this film, Takeover of the Young Lords of Lincoln Hospital in New York. And what they did there, in terms of making an institution that was totally relevant, welcoming to the community. You go into any hospital in Chicago and you're a person of color and see how you're treated. I don't care which one it is, even Cook County. And I know that people, at least that I know in our community, have some serious issues. with how they are treated. And so if at the door of a hospital, you are already rejected, how the hell can we be talking about improving medical care? And this is not to take away of the importance that Dr. Linda Ray Murray pointed out. We lock the doors to people all over the world. In Cuba, medicine is made available to the poorest, to the most marginalized. I mean, you can criticize all you want in Cuba. I've been to Cuba, and I never saw anyone on the street dying from hunger, looking decrepit, looking like they had not received medical care. I didn't see that. And so maybe people have seen this, but when you look at a society and look at the most vulnerable and look at how they're treated, something right is happening in terms of the idea that healthcare and health is a incredible, important human right.
And Magda, I think it happens every day. So because I think that's an important question. It happens every day. So you can't risk getting fired every second an insult happens, because then you wouldn't last but 30 seconds. but what it does mean is you can speak up. You can speak up at every meeting. You know, so let's talk about these big grants we have in terms of trying to involve communities, and especially community oriented research. You know, every delay that comes from the goddamn legal people before a contract gets signed, you know, this is hurting people. People can't make their payroll. The very notion of how we do the grants, you know, at least with the city grants, for example, with the public sector grants, you got to spend the grant money before you can get reimbursed. Okay, so this is like a poor person. Okay, I'm going to pay for your food, but just give me the receipt from the restaurant. You know, in what world does that make sense? To understand that conflict and disagreement is the lifeblood of science. So when I'm going to tell you, we all know this. If two professors are having a conflict, usually nothing horrible happens. They just have a conflict. When the community group and the university has a conflict, the community group gets screwed. Either they don't get the contract or they get short, you know. And so this happens all the time. And the inability to pretend that it doesn't happen on a daily basis is a major problem. And let me just also say, because I know there are a lot of people of color on this conference, this doesn't disappear just because some of the researchers are people of color. And in fact, in the real world, they may get in worse trouble. You know, again, to be crude, it's one thing for a white boy to sort of violate NIH rules. When it's a person of color tries to violate NIH rules, they're in big trouble. So we have to support each other. We have to be willing to say clearly out loud what's going on. We don't have to agree with everything, but we do have to be willing to say, this community group, it says this, and this community group says that. That's the other thing. Stop in our communities, they're vibrant, diverse places. People disagree all the time. So don't just pick the group that you like because you like what they're saying. Okay, you better pay attention to the whole community and listen carefully to all those diverse voices. And if we're not willing to do that, then you will eventually end up being harmed by this. But it comes from pushing every day, a little bit, every time you hear a problem, say a problem, at least call it up and call it out.
So Magdalena, I'm going to have to leave. I know that you're in good hands, all of you, with Linda. She's an amazing communicator and an amazing human being. And so thank you for having me and allow me to share this moment with her in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Gracias, señor.
Adiós.
Bye-bye. So going back to what you were just talking about, Dr. Murray, how do you empower, if that's the right word, folks who do want to say something and who do want to speak up, but are too afraid?
Well, I don't think you can, quote unquote, empower other people. I mean, I don't know. I don't even, that concept bothers me. I don't think you can empower people. I think what you can do is listen to people and treat those opinions with respect. Again, you don't have to agree with them, but you just treat them with respect and try to be clear what, my first goal is to try to understand clearly what someone else is trying to say, what their perspective is and what the difference might be with my perspective, etc. So it's not a question of empowering. I think some structural things we can do is, so for example, we have to fight for those structural changes. We don't think just because you get one grant, you can do everything with one grant. You can't do that no matter how big the grant is. So what that means is, so for example, let me pick on UIC and Northwestern for a moment. We should be fighting for a decent public school system, period. Don't tell me about pipeline programs. I mean, those are nice, but the fact that we have to have a pipeline program is already an admission that we failed. If we had high quality, equal education in this country, we wouldn't have to have any goddamn pipeline programs because we would have students learning things all over and they would find their way in areas that they were interested in. So when we fail to fight for Chicago public schools, when we allow without comment the percent of Black teachers to go from over 20%, 20 years ago to under 10% today, that's a problem. And we should, in Northwestern, we should be speaking up about that. That's far more important than the latest pipeline program we got funded. Again, I'm not against the pipeline programs, but that's not enough. And we need to ask ourselves, when we get these pipeline programs, where are we pulling people from? Are we pulling them from suburban schools or parochial schools? Or are we pulling them from the schools that are marginalized, where people really need some help? So I think that I don't think it's a question of empowering. I think it's a question of investment and using the forces of the institutions which we don't control, let's be honest, but it's not like Northwestern University of Chicago. It's not like they don't have some power in the context of our community. Using those institutional power bases to fight for real changes in the structure of our city and region. And we don't do that. And the schools are reluctant to do that. And we should call them out for not doing that.
Thank you. I do have a question that somebody is asking. How does historical medical mistrust affect our efforts to address COVID-19 today?
Again, I don't think it's a medical I don't like that word, medical mistrust. So we have a system of science in this country where we don't explain to people what high blood pressure means. Think how many people have high blood pressure and how many people take medicine. We don't explain what it means or how the medicines work, or the fact that there's a disagreement on what medicine to use when. So the very fact that we say that we're science-based, and which is a lie, we're not doing it. We don't explain to people how science is. The notion that science is the same as a religion, that is frustrating. So when we say confusing things to people, or we're basing this decision on science, what does that mean? We don't. It's like saying we practice medicine by a recipe. We don't do that. Public health is an art, and there's so many things involved in decisions about it. It's not a cut and dry decision. So the reality is we have allowed our public health infrastructure in this country to degenerate. We lost 250,000 public health workers in the past 20 years. We don't have a data infrastructure. It's like the bridges in public health are all collapsing. And then we wonder why people are confused about what we're doing and saying. So that's the problem. It's not a problem of a lack of trust. The problem is we haven't talked about public health. We haven't talked about science. We haven't talked about pandemics. I'm retired now as a physician, but in my career as a physician, I can think of a number of global pandemics that have occurred, but most Americans can't think of anything but coronavirus. So that's a problem. So we do a disservice to our students, and we do a disservice to the public in not discussing in any kind of close to a systematic or scientific way what's really going on, and not allowing people to see the debates and arguments that we're having in the scientific community.
Thank you. I'm gonna open it for some questions, if anybody else has questions. If not, I'm gonna ask another one. What can researchers and academic entities do different to facilitate reciprocal and trusting relationships with communities that have been abused by historical research practices? How can they start implementing?
So I think the first thing is to change the questions that we're asking as researchers. So for example, let's go back to COVID. As you know, remember, the city set up this emergency task force approach to COVID because COVID's just reflecting the inequities that are already there. So that means taking some time and learning about the source of those inequities and why those inequities are there, why some communities function differently than other communities. It means learning the history, of the communities. You don't have time to do this always in the midst of the pandemic, right, while you're trying to fight a fire, but it needs to be an ongoing process where you're learning about those differences. So they're important. For example, differences between the West Side Black culture and the South Side Black culture. As someone not born and raised in Chicago, I've observed this for decades. I find it a fascinating process. But if you just come in and you pretend that they're both the same, you're not going to do very well with research in our city. What's going on in the suburban arenas outside of the city of Chicago? We operate in old paradigms. For example, the city of Chicago hasn't been the port of entry for new immigrants for over a quarter of a century. So where are the new immigrants going? They don't first land in the city any longer. They land in other places outside of the city limits. So it means understanding that we don't know as researchers what's going on. And the first question is, what are we really trying to get our hands around? What questions are we trying to ask? So that means taking the time, just like you do a literature review before you write an article, you have to do a scoping view of the communities that you're working in before you start mucking around with research questions. The other thing, again, I know this is difficult because people want to fund this reductionist question, but we have to begin to ask different kinds of questions. Okay, because the answers are always complicated. So the notion that we're trying to stratify and control for everything, well, do you know anybody whose life is controlled? Do you know any teenage girl who everything is controlled and you're going to say, how come one got pregnant and one didn't? We have to be willing to ask sloppy, hard questions because the world is sloppy and hard. And we have to be willing to work with other groups. I think that's the major thing Jose was trying to say. You have to be willing to work with communities and help get an understanding. It's not a question of academics helping them understand. It's a question of being willing to learn from communities about what's really going on in the real world and why that matters. So for example, again, during COVID, there was all these plans to make sure people were getting food and deliveries. But the reality is the way our country was set up, if you were in a hybrid family, that is some members here with documents and some without, the people in hybrid families were not eligible for the same support that people with documents were. And that created major problems in our communities. And so knowing that ahead of time and making a decision to address that would help. So here's something Northwestern could do. I always say, admit and give scholarships to people who are undocumented and need to be in medical school and nursing school. How about that? That's simple. Northwestern has a lot of money. That's something they know how to do. There you go. Start there. Do 10 a year to start off with. Be conservative and start with 10. So if we're not willing to do those kinds of things, then we're not serious about change.
Thank you. Angel has their hand up. Angel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Linda Ray Murray and everyone. My name's Dr. Angel Miles, and I'm the Healthcare Home and Community-Based Services Policy Analyst at Access Living. I'm also a Black woman with a physical disability. I use a wheelchair. I was born with something called spina bifida. So I am an anomaly in that I'm a researcher, but I'm multiply marginalized from low income community, all that stuff. So I understand research, but then I also understand like the lived experience. And so I take a lot of the work that's done, really seriously, really personally. And it's really hard to be a multiply marginalized person and be a researcher because research is predominantly done by people who are not from those communities. And then when the day is over, they can just go back to, their lives. And for me, when the day is over, like I still, have to deal with healthcare, fix my wheelchair and all that stuff. So it's very real to me. And I guess my comment is more so, that we need to address how research is a business, and just the role of capitalism, and how it's been used to enrich other more privileged folks, while studying marginalized people, and how those same marginalized groups have not been able to economically benefit, not only like socially and medically benefit, but like economically benefit from research. Um, and also, I would say that what also concerns me is that oftentimes research constantly like studies inequality, but it's not in a reasonable enough time doing things to eradicate inequality. And I feel like oftentimes that's by design, because it's like there's a desire to study inequality in order to manage and control it, but not necessarily eradicate it. So like, to manage and control the inequality, to make sure it doesn't get out of hand, so that inequality doesn't impact the most privileged folks, but not necessarily eradicate it. And so, there's hundreds of articles and studies about disabled people and unemployment. Like, we don't necessarily we don't need another study about that. Like, there's just so many things that we're just constantly studying: housing inequality. And like, we know what the answer is. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that perspective, just the role of capitalism and power when it comes to research. And finally, one other thing was that, when I look at like COVID, for example, and the issue of power, and that for people with disabilities, when there are decisions being made about who gets vaccinated and da 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 da, a lot of that decisions are based on data, but there's not data about disabled people. And so, when we would talk to the state about, how to ensure that disabled people have priorities over getting vaccine or whatever, and the argument was often, well, the data suggests that like aging people or other groups should get it, but they're not asking disabled, like they don't collect data about us, but then they're making decisions about us based on a lack of data. So like, so research is also, very much about power, and that's really frustrating. And so I'm not sure like what can be done about it, but I think that when groups in power say that marginalized people don't trust research, they the onus needs to be on research institutions. So often it's like there's something wrong with us because we don't trust them, instead of thinking about what medical institutions and academic institutions, et cetera, can do to become trustworthy. Like, so the onus has to be on them, not like, oh, well, we're just like irrational people. And so that really frustrates me. So anyway, those are just like some of my thoughts, and it's not really like a question per se, but I just wanted to thank you for all of your insights.
Well, thank you. I think that statement is an important contribution to this conversation, and I agree with it. I think that there's no question in my mind that the role of racism and capitalism are intertwined. So let me just say, I certainly support that notion. The other thing I just mentioned when you talk, so one thing I want to be clear about, since we're talking to researchers, data never says anything. I don't care what kind of data. Human beings say stuff. Human beings interpret their understanding of, quote, whatever they think data is. Data never speaks by itself. And the Native Americans, I think, have a concept of data genocide, which I think has real meaning, not just for Native American communities, but for other communities, like with people who are differently abled, so that we have to understand and remember that if you don't collect the information, if you don't ask the question, you're in essence erasing those people, that group, from the planet. That's what they mean when they say data genocide. So but please don't say, and I think that's one thing that confuses people, because they think it's a simple answer, yes or no, masks or not. That, you know, the data never speaks for itself. We as human beings interpret that information, and hopefully we interpret it in a specific historical and cultural context. So we might have some hope of actually accomplishing what we're trying to do.
Well, I agree with that. And I get, but when the data is not even there, and so,
Right.
like for example, with COVID, there's a lot of ableism in the arguments about COVID, because when data is reported, it excludes disabled people in the race that we're getting COVID, and then it's often just assumed with like, oh well, you know, they're disabled anyway, so they were gonna die anyway, and like that's not the case. If it wasn't for COVID, we might have been living with our disabilities, but we weren't necessarily going to die. And so what's really frustrating is the way that the people who are at most risk for COVID are kind of being dismissed. And if policies were taken that that prioritize those who are most at risk, then we would not be in the situation that we're in today. But because we don't value aging people and we don't value disabled people, then when the pandemic first came out, it was just like, well, the people who are most at risk are like older people and disabled people. So like, you know, and it was just like, you know, so, and even now it's like the numbers are going down, but for who? Like, and so if we don't prioritize, you know, those who are most marginalized first, then we're all going to be at risk.
I want to thank everyone so much for being part of this wonderful conversation. Dr. Murray, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and send a follow-up email with a recording, of course. And then we hope to see everyone at the next 2 series. There will be more information about dates and times following up. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.